The Kremlin has long used their restrictive freedom of speech laws to crack down on anti-war dissidents. But now the Kremlin is getting so desperate to control the narrative of the war that they're even targeting their own pro-war mill bloggers. Just how bad are things getting? And is this the start of the Kremlin internal civil war? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So we talked about the fact that, the Russian oligarchy and the Russian public in some ways, particularly a subgroup of ultra-nationalist Russians, that the Kremlin maintains control of them using carrots and sticks, right? They offer benefits to those who go along with the state narrative, and they offer punishments to those that turn against it. And the secret to staying in power when you're a dictator is to use the carrot a lot more than the stick, right? If you're doing it good, the stick is only for obvious cases, and the carrots seem much juicier. But when you start to lose your grip on power, well, dictators turn more and more to the stick. And that's what we're seeing here inside of Russia. You see, the repressive machinery that squashes any dissent has begun to target pro-war mill bloggers, right? A pro-Kremlin pundit who for years hailed Vladimir Putin as one of history's great men, right, has, and also a military blogger, fundraiser for Russian troops, and a pro-Russian Ukrainian-born fighter have all found themselves on the wrong end of state censorship. And this is what's kind of insane. All of those people had recently been designated this year as foreign agents, a label used previously against anti-Putin voices, carrying a negative Soviet-era connotation. It obligates people to identify themselves as foreign agents on social media and in other publications, and exposes them to crippling financial limitations, right? And the insane part, again, is that some of actually the even more staunch mill bloggers have been designated not just foreign agents, but the even worse label, a terrorist and extremist. This is a label reserved previously for people like Alexei Navalny and his team. Really some of the so-called worst of the worst in terms of Kremlin critics. Now, taken together, analysts say this points to a new trend, a purge not only of anti-war dissenters, but also of the regime's supporters, as rival factions within the system turn on each other. I found this interesting. A Russian political scientist said, quote, "First they, the Kremlin, went after anti-war voices. Now there are none left, and the repressive machine cannot be stopped." And this is, on one hand, sort of a very dictatorship, authoritarian train of events, in which you create this law that says, listen, we have to go after these extremists and these anti-war peaceniks, and then you get rid of all them, and then you turn around and say, well, who's the most extreme anti-war voices now? And you go, well, it's these people who maybe they support the war, but maybe they're critical of high command or the decisions the highest levels of command have made. And you go, well, they're now as anti-war as anyone is in the space. So suddenly they become the targets. And I'm not going to act like this isn't something that happens in democracies as well, not usually to this scale, but certainly you see it now, right? Where a bunch of laws in the US were passed in the early 2000s about targeting terrorism, people who literally advocated for the complete and total destruction of the United States by violence. But you see that once the threat of Islamic terrorism sort of mitigated somewhat, you see the same designations now being applied to political opponents. We talked about this on this channel, that the government now is turning around and saying, well, actually, know who else is an anti-government terrorist? Those leftists, those capitalists, people who get mad at Trump for building a ballroom using slush funds provided by companies he regulates. So this is in some ways it's a feature of governments, but authoritarian governments supercharge it because silencing dissent is so important to them. And the one analyst describes the divide between two rival camps: veteran propagandists bound to the defense ministry and the Kremlin, known as loyalists, and what they call a sprawling grassroots movement of ultra-nationalist war supporters, known as militarists or Z-bloggers. And That network is hundreds of prominent bloggers, volunteer activists that raised money, bought drones and vehicles, delivered supplies directly to the front lines. Right? It took shape as a network after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, when it became clear the army often failed to provide even the most basic equipment and support. So in some ways, they existed first as an element of against the state, or highlighting the state's failures. But because they supported the war and worked so tirelessly to promote it, the state actually embraced them for a while. And for a time, the strategy was to actually bring these mill bloggers into the tent. In some cases, prominent bloggers were given positions within the Ministry of Defense. And again, we're seeing something in parallel play out now, where a lot of the pro-administration bloggers and vloggers find themselves getting preferential access, entering the White House press pool, for example. Again, it's not something that is isolated to authoritarian governments, but it is done best by them. And here's the problem, and it's a problem that ultimately I think the Trump administration is going to find as well. I didn't really start out with to have this video be a comparison, but it's really hard not to see the parallels, honestly. Is that ultimately, if these bloggers and volunteer activists wanted to toe the lines of a government, they would have done so, right? Like, if I already worked, for example, I'm another of a sort of flavor of this kind of person. Obviously, I'm politically very much the opposite and want the war to end, but also see Ukraine maintain its sovereignty as a country and to see America's enemy defeated. Shocker. But ultimately, I spent 7 years already working in the U.S. government under their restrictions, right? Plus the other 5 I spent in the military. If that was what I wanted, I would have done it. So I run a YouTube channel because I don't want to be controlled by a government. That's the whole point of this. So ultimately, the Kremlin's belief that they could go to these bloggers and bring them into the umbrella and turn them into these state loyalists is a farce. The whole point is that nobody tells them what to say on Telegram. And we point this out. The hardline militarists have openly criticized the way the war is being waged. Their independence of the state has led Moscow to endorse some of the attacks against them. And Shulman simply says, autocracies fear civic mobilization of any kind. Any authentic movement, including a pro-war one, is perceived as obstructive and potentially dangerous, right? And we talk about the fact, they even acknowledge that this was sort of how Igor Girkin got himself into trouble in 2024, where he, again, was a pro-war figure, but he became increasingly critical of the way the war was being run and eventually began to criticize those too close to power and ended up in jail and is possibly dead, right? For example, we've seen Vladimir Solovyov, the sort of aging host of that like pro-war television show, is seen as being the face of the loyalist camp, with close ties to the defense ministry, and he has spearheaded efforts to purge pro-war bloggers and volunteers, angry that many of them raised more funds for the front than his own state-approved charity, which, again, if you know anything about Russia, you know that a lot of these sort of, there's a lot of grift and graft and a lot of greasing palms to make things happen. And, donating to a state-approved charity is one thing, but I think this is probably a farce. Framing it as just like a television host seething and coping. If he wasn't permitted by the Kremlin to go after them, he would not. Okay, he's a propagandist. He doesn't attack people that he isn't approved to attack. Okay, that's how these people work, right? Now, anti-Putin forces, right, are laughing at this because, quote, one said, quote, it's been amusing to watch how those who never objected when liberals were imprisoned are suddenly discovering that justice in Russia is selective, that literally anyone can be thrown in jail without cause. Right? They joke that it's a common, it's just the old Soviet refrain, Comrade Stalin, a terrible mistake has been made, which is a phrase uttered by devoted communists who realized too late that Stalin's purges don't even spare the faithful, right? Hours after being labeled a foreign agent, Markov said, quote, it's some sort of misunderstanding. And a different one adopted language literally used by human rights groups, lamenting that the foreign agents law, quote, violates the Russian constitution itself and was, quote, a serious infringement of civil rights. Which, boy, if you thought you were an enemy of the Russian state before, try citing the inviolable rights of individuals within the Russian constitution and try to claim that you have civil rights. So it's a sign, a bad sign. And by the way, it's not just rando vloggers that are getting in trouble here. The Kremlin is also, well, forced to deny that Lavrov might be out of favor himself, in part because the summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin got canceled, right? And since then, Lavrov has not really been seen. He was absent from a key meeting of the chaired by Putin of the Russian Security Council, which, again, tends to, in Soviet-inspired systems, really indicate that somebody isn't on the inside with his boss. So these are strange times for the Russian government. This is probably as hard as the war has ever been politically for Putin. Anyway, guys, become a member of Combat Vet News. You can do it at combatvetnews.com and support the channel, or you can just do it by tapping that Become a Member button of YouTube. And of course, thanks to the folks like Alfred Chesky, Alan Knutson, Christine Schumann, Dan M, Deborah Oppenheimer, and all of our Lieutenant Tier members. Couldn't do it without you. We'll see you in the next one. Cheers.